The most ambitious players on the world stage know that global influence won't be won with the hard power of military might, but with the soft power of persuasion and cultural influence. And in the battle for the hearts and minds of the world, the news media is king.
Hello, I'm Jane Dutton in Doha. This is the Al Jazeera News Hour.
Hello and welcome to Russia Today, 24-hour news live from Moscow.
Hello, welcome to World News. I'm John Bowles at the CNN Center. Here's
It's 6:30 a.m. here in the Iranian capital, Tehran. This is Press TV's World News.
Tel Aviv,
Perth, Accra.
Wherever you are, you're with the BBC.
In this series, I'll be exploring how nations are flexing their muscle through the media.
A well-resourced global news organization is considerably cheaper than putting a few aircraft on the deck of an aircraft carrier.
In this first programme, how the concept of soft power was born.
I call that ability to get what you want without coercion or payment a soft power.
How it's measured.
I think if you distill it in its rawest form, it can come down to who's the most attractive person in the room.
And how it helped ignite the Arab Spring.
Written in English, it says, "Thank you, Facebook." Indeed, some have dubbed this the Facebook revolution.
Protesters demanding the downfall of the regime in Egypt earlier this year. A striking example of how traditional and online media can capture the want of the people and drive a force for change. A force so powerful it can beat the hard power of the government trying to suppress it. The term soft power was first identified 20 years ago by American academic Joseph Nye. The concept of hegemony, rule by consent, was already a recognised term, but Nye was pinpointing something more precise.
I was using it as an analytical term. I was trying to explain when you were describing the power of a country, and you looked at the military power and the economic power, which was the usual way of looking, there's still something missing, which is the ability to get what you want through attraction and persuasion. And so I called that ability to get what you want without coercion or payment a soft power. Sometimes it's misused by political leaders. They say soft power is anything that's not military. So sometimes people will call economic sanctions soft power. They're not. Economic sanctions are, in my terminology, a form of hard power. They're coercive.
20 years on, and soft power has evolved as the world has changed. In an international context, some see it as a somewhat mystical force that some countries have and others simply don't. Tyler Brûlé is the editor-in-chief of Monocle magazine, and his 21st century definition of the term is somewhat less academic than Joseph Nye's.
Well, I think if you distill it in its rawest form, it can come down to who's the most attractive person in the room. In a national sense, that means what is their tone of voice when they deliver the news to the rest of the world.
Brûlé's publication, Monocle, runs an annual soft power survey in partnership with the Institute for Government, which ranks nations on their soft power in everything from media to music and football to fashion.
There's been so much discussion about soft power, and we decided, well, let's actually come up with a set of metrics, and part of it will be scientific, part of it will be subjective, and let's figure out who's really got it. And in going through the process, we had to look at pop culture elements as much as all of the basics. How many embassies or cultural missions does a nation have? How powerful is their voice as a public service broadcaster, or if they indeed have strong commercial news outlets?
Whilst the Monocle ranking acknowledges a country's wider cultural influence, news organisations are increasingly critical in the global soft power battle. The established players are the likes of the BBC World Service, CNN and the Voice of America. But arguably the most prominent right now is Al Jazeera.
Al Jazeera, 4 broadcast centres with a fresh eye on world stories.
It's Lauren in Doha, can you hear me?
Journalist Hugh Miles has worked for Al Jazeera and written a book about its challenge to the West. He told me about the network's early days.
Shortly after the current Emir of Qatar had acceded to the throne in a coup, he put this plan into operation right away to set up a news service. And after a bit of fiddling around and morphing over the months, it began broadcasting in November 1996, and it benefited a lot at the beginning from the collapse of the BBC Arabic service that had happened shortly before. And so Al Jazeera established credibility and won the trust of Arab viewers a long time ago, and it continues to have that trust, and that makes it an extremely influential, perhaps the most powerful non-state actor in the region.
Al Jazeera, in a very short span of time, was able to put the capital of its home nation on the map. How many people really thought that the news at the top of the hour would be coming from Doha? I think muscular global news organizations are incredibly important as part of the equation. And I have to say, it's also quite an inexpensive way. When you're talking in soft power terms, the cost of running a well-oiled, well-resourced global news organization is considerably cheaper than putting a few aircraft on the deck of an aircraft carrier.
Al Jazeera's rapid rise to prominence was publicly acknowledged by US Secretary of State Hillary Clinton earlier this year.
Where you've got a set of global networks that Al Jazeera has been the leader in that are literally changing people's minds and attitudes. And like it or hate it, it is really effective. And in fact, viewership of Al Jazeera is going up in the United States because it's real news. You may not agree with it, but...
Clinton's statement came in February this year, when the Arab Spring was blossoming. Many people regard Al Jazeera's role in the revolutions in the region as its CNN moment, a nod to that network's rise to prominence in the first Gulf War. Joseph Nye is in no doubt why Al Jazeera has been so successful.
Al Jazeera's had a brilliant strategy of appealing to the street in Arab countries in which the media were controlled by government. So there was a huge vacuum which they were able to fill. Since so much of the television was official government propaganda, there was a great desire or thirst for real news. And Al Jazeera stepped in and supplied that. So in that sense, it's been quite a successful strategy, but it's also worth noticing that it's a strategy for export. You don't ever see or hear criticism of the ruling family in Qatar.
The Arab Spring has helped Al Jazeera reach an audience desperate for a non-governmental voice, as Nabila Ramdani, a journalist and academic specialising in the Arab world, told me.
I think Al Jazeera proved in the context of the Arab Spring that clearly they had very good access to the people on the ground. The people they had access to were essentially their audience. You can't win a revolution by force alone. You have to give people the feeling that they have a stake in the economy, a stake in the worldwide community, that they can have a say in politics. And I think satellite television played a crucial role in conveying all that.
Here's a reminder of our top story on Al Jazeera, the battle for Egypt. Clashes on the streets have continued between pro-democracy supporters and those backing President Hosni Mubarak.
Abdallah Al-Salmi is a Middle East analyst for BBC Monitoring. He closely followed how Al Jazeera operated during the uprisings and how the authorities reacted to this and other international media interest.
Al Jazeera's role angered the Egyptian authorities, which shut down its transmission on the Egyptian government-owned satellite and then closed their offices. But nevertheless, there seems to have been a bond between the protesters and Al Jazeera to the extent that they set up giant screens in Al Tahrir Square so that they can watch what is showing. So Al Jazeera's a unique point here is that since its rise in the second half of the 90s, it has always given voice to the voiceless. It has always allowed opposition activists and groups to express their opinions and tell the world what they want.
It is a crucial role, but one that angered the Egyptian government, as Hugh Miles explains.
Interestingly, in all these Arab countries, we see the same pattern of events as the dictators blame outside forces and then blame Al Jazeera. And blaming Al Jazeera, blaming the media generally, and specifically the Arab media, is just one of the steps along the way of overthrowing these regimes. And all the regimes have done it, and no doubt other regimes will do it in the future.
Al Jazeera may be celebrated by the people it's giving voice to, but it's not immune to guarding its own interests. Nabila Ramdani.
Al Jazeera alone cannot provide a comprehensive coverage of the Arab Spring. It is media organizations which has an agenda, which has interests in the region, and it proved on many occasions to be very selective in its coverage. I'm thinking essentially of the coverage of the uprisings in Bahrain, where Qatar was a part of the GCC countries which went in Bahrain along with Saudi Arabia to suppress pro-democracy movements, and hence the lack of or very scarce reports on the situation in Bahrain.
But Al Jazeera is in fact two very distinct networks, one English and one Arabic. Language is far from the only difference between the two. Hugh Miles.
Well, I think that there's been a clear division in Al Jazeera's coverage of the Arab Spring between the Al Jazeera English channel and the Al Jazeera Arabic channel. The Al Jazeera English channel has been broadly or very sympathetic to the Arab uprisings, and in fact has been quite significant really in propelling them along for a whole variety of reasons. I mean, it's helped ordinary people with their tactics and strategy to overthrow the regime, and it's given opposition figures an opportunity to speak out and given people a platform, and none of these new players have got a public profile yet. So Al Jazeera helps give them a public profile, allows them to set out policy, and that's key. But Al Jazeera Arabic has been, I think, deficient in its coverage of the Arab Spring, particularly in the Gulf region. I'm thinking of Bahrain. Clearly, events in the Gulf impinge directly on Qatar's national security. And so I think that Al Jazeera Arabic has been more reserved in how it's covered events in the Gulf.
Al Jazeera isn't the only player in the region battling for soft power. There's Al-Manar, Hezbollah's channel, broadcast from Lebanon. And then there's Al-Hurra, or the Free One, funded by the US Department of Defense. Its mission? To provide objective, accurate and relevant news to the people of the Middle East about the region, the world, and crucially, about the United States.
Soon a new television service will begin providing reliable news and information across the region.
الحرة في قلب الحدث لرصد خلفياته وأبعاده نواكب كل جديد.
Joseph Nye, the man who coined the term soft power, doesn't believe Al-Hurra is the right tool to exert it for America.
Well, I think the problem with Al-Hurra was that it was seen as American government propaganda. When I talk to friends in the Middle East, they say has fine production values, they spend a lot of money on it, it's very slick, but since it's regarded as American government propaganda, they don't watch it. I think it could have done better if it had been more subtle, and I think the fact that the BBC is viewed and has credibility indicates that there's some possibility there. But in the context in which Al-Hurra was created, which was the aftermath of 9/11 and then the invasion of Iraq, I think there was bound to be a degree of suspicion.
It's not allowed to broadcast inside the United States because of the Smith-Mundt Act, which prohibits competition between government channels and US private channels. It's really the media arm of the US government, and it was a complete failure in the Arab world. It was rejected out of hand because obviously people are not stupid. They're very alert to propaganda. They know that it's financed by the Americans, so they only look at it to get the American point of view. Not only was it rejected in the Arab world, it was also immediately stabbed in the back in Washington because the Voice of America, which many people think would have been a more appropriate vehicle for disseminating the US point of view because it's got a history and a credibility that Al-Hurra didn't have, was passed over for funding, and the money was given to Al-Hurra instead.
Live from Dubai,
So it wasn't a success.
Cairo, Jerusalem, and the United States.
But in any case, traditional broadcast news no longer enjoys a monopoly of media soft power in the Middle East. Social media became a game-changing force to mobilise anti-government protesters. This was the soft power of the people being exercised against the hard power of governments. Joseph Nye again.
It used to be said of Egypt that there was no alternative. You either supported the autocrat, Mubarak, or you wound up with the religious extremists of the Muslim Brotherhood, that there was no middle. But the burgeoning information revolution essentially created the new middle that we saw in Tahrir Square. And what's more, provided them with devices like Twitter and Facebook to coordinate. And that is a very different world. It's changed the politics.
There's still revolutionary graffiti everywhere here in Tunisia. There's one spray-painted thought that does really stand out. Written in English, it says, "Thank you, Facebook." That's a reference, of course, to the way that news of the Tunisian uprising was spread around the country through the social networking site. Indeed, some have dubbed this the Facebook revolution.
Abdallah Al-Salmi has been monitoring the role of traditional and social media during the Arab Spring for the BBC.
The main role of the social media in the Arab Spring is twofold. The first is providing an alternative communication channel with the world, informing the world opinion and the world media about what actually is happening in the country. The second fold is their ability to mobilize protesters.
One of the most potent examples of this came in January, when a Facebook page set up in the name of a young Egyptian who'd been tortured to death by the authorities was used to energize anti-government protests. Its founder, Google executive Wael Ghonim, became an international figure after he was captured by Egyptian authorities.
Wael Ghonim emerged from 12 days detention to find himself a hero. A local TV station has been replaying this interview. He said he wasn't a hero and he broke down when they told the stories of people who've been killed protesting. I want to say sorry to every mother and father that lost their son, but it wasn't our fault. It's the fault of all those holding on to power who won't let it go. They didn't need to add the sad music. His message electrified his new followers.
Everyone knows how basically the Egyptian revolution was unofficially led by a Google executive who is a blogger as well. So at the same time, we have social media that is really representative of large sectors of the middle class, if we can say of the educated middle class in those countries, versus the old regimes and their own oppressed and censored media.
Hugh Miles believes that this transfer of soft power into the hands of citizens is set to reshape the media landscape in the Middle East.
I think that soft power is closely connected to technological developments. I think that as the price of technology comes down and it becomes easier with consumer electronics to make and distribute your own media material, this is going to have a political impact as well. So we can expect to see a lot of changes in the region in the coming years because obviously the media is moving very fast.
Nabila Ramdani.
I think news organisations indeed relied a lot on testimonies coming out of countries, mainly through footage taken from mobile phones, for example. And that reflects the power of images.
And only exposed, really, by social media and by, as you say, pictures, mobile phones and blogging. Personal testimony. Exposed
by a combination of new social media by the inhabitants of those countries, but also by the expertise and the knowledge of trained journalism who would turn this footage into quality journalism and explain its content, what it means in the context of those countries.
Abdallah Al-Salmi.
Well, I would say this convergence between social media and traditional media, such as TV stations and radios, has been very effective in providing updated news and sometimes very accurate news of what's happening in Arab countries that witnessed revolutions. So while the membership of Facebook and the penetration of Facebook among populations might not reach 90 or 100%, but the fact that these satellite channels took this content from social media and then broadcast it to a larger audience made its impact much more stronger.
I think that the non-mainstream media, the so-called blogosphere, does play a very important role. But it is interesting to note the interrelationship with the classical, what's called high-quality press. You pick up a rumor of some extraordinarily interesting rumor on any blog, and you say, can that possibly be true? What do? You go to the Times or the BBC or Wall Street Journal or some other credible mainstream media, and you say, if they haven't picked this up, then maybe it's not. Maybe I'd better not believe it. So the role of editor or cue giver or allocating attention in this overly supplied information world, the sort of the high-quality press still plays a significant role.
Nabila Ramdani believes there is a limit to the effectiveness of social media as a source of news.
You cannot substitute in the end for trained professional journalism in the days before social media and what is called citizen journalism, most stories started with real people. And those who saw something incredible or perceived a great injustice or simply had a radical opinion about something would do everything they could to get their message to a wider audience. The most obvious way to do this was to contact a journalist, and he would take your leaked paper, your scrappy roll of film, or your unique testimony and would turn it into quality journalism. And whatever you say, I think, about the power of social media and citizen journalism, that is still what is happening today. And it is still, in my opinion, professional journalists who refine basic information and make it newsworthy.
Of course, the very regimes that social media is challenging do, in turn, exploit it to flex their anti-revolutionary muscle.
Well, we have seen since the beginning of the rise of Facebook in Egypt, for example, and in Tunisia, that while the governments did not block Facebook, they actually monitored effectively and managed to, for example, obtain information on the identity of the protesters and their future plans. The biggest example of the power of social media and the internet is when the Egyptian authorities actually shut off the internet from the whole country in Egypt during the revolution.
Although we like to think that ICTs, the internet, leads to democratization, it's also a very handy tool for regimes to round up activists, pro-democracy activists or pro-Islamist activists or anybody, because the regime can hunt people down. So it's also a tool in the regime's armory. It's very easy and I think rather fashionable to attribute the changes sweeping the Middle East to soft power, to the media in particular. But in fact, I think that other factors are more important, like whether the army will shoot demonstrators and how people feel about corruption in their country. So it's very difficult to break down what causes what.
But there are situations where social media is essential.
Another day of violence in Cairo. Clashes on the streets have continued between pro-democracy supporters and those backing President Hosni Mubarak. At least 13 people have died, it could be many more, and 1,200 at least have been injured. There's also been a concerted effort to silence the media. Dozens of international journalists have been beaten and arrested, their equipment confiscated.
When professional journalists are locked out, as it were, of certain countries, surely that is when bloggers come into their own, that they are absolutely crucial in that situation, are they not?
I think news organisations indeed relied a lot on testimonies coming out of countries, mainly through footage taken from mobile phones, for example. And that reflects the power of images rather than words often. And we've seen very shocking footage of repression, of brutality coming out of countries such as Syria, but also Egypt to a certain extent, countries we would associate, with civilization.
Hugh Miles.
Home-produced or cheaply produced media, music, videos, people re-editing and cutting up news footage and so on in their bedrooms and distributing it on the internet does have an impact. Of course, it's hard to gauge that impact, and one has to bear in mind that 50% of adult Egyptians, for example, the most populous country, are illiterate. And although most people can access a mobile phone, many people don't have access to computers, especially women. I think it's careful not to fetishize the role of the media in the Arab Spring. There's a lot of talk about Twitter and Facebook. It's interesting that in Libya, which has always been one of the most closed, or perhaps the most closed of all Arab countries in terms of media, with no networks, no real online community at all, a very, very minimal internet presence. They've now had a pro-democracy uprising. And of course, there's always been revolutions. It hasn't always been Twitter and Facebook. So it's normal and expected that revolutionaries should use the media of the time to try and help themselves, and revolutionaries have always done that, whether it's postal ships or pigeons or whatever it was, and today they use the internet. So I wouldn't be too shocked about that. I mean, what do we expect them to use? Smoke signals?
So, granted, social media didn't start the Arab Spring, it merely helped organise it. But what can't be denied is that together with Al Jazeera, it focused the eyes of the world on the everyday frustrations of the man and woman on the street. So when the dust settles and new democracies are formed, Where does this leave Al Jazeera?
As these governments become more pluralized, one would hope that they will allow more open media, and if there's more open media, then that would mean that Al Jazeera will have competition. So we'll have to hope that that pluralization comes. If, on the other hand, you find authoritarian governments that continue to control the media, then there'll still be an important thirst and role for Al Jazeera.
Liberalizing the media also involves the creation of partisan media that might not be able to cater for the taste of all the audiences. So things like Al Jazeera, things like BBC Arabic, France 24 will always be needed in that part of the world.
So Al Jazeera, its Middle Eastern cohorts and even social media are having their day in the sun. Together they combine into a modern force for soft power, one that's helping to reshape the region politically, economically and culturally. But it would be dangerous to ignore the organisations that have been doing this for their own countries for generations.